Welcome everybody to our Fairbank lecture series with Richard Davis, a graduate of the University of Rochester. He is with us today to speak on my work on the Iran sanctions of 1979 and international sanctions against Russia today. I am Ruben Flores, chair of the Department of History. And when Jenna first told me that Mr. Davis was coming to campus, I leapt at the chance. One of the courses that I teach is the history of the American Empire. And some of my students are in attendance here today. Thank you for coming. But questions of empire also come up, obviously in the context of Latin America, another series of courses that I teach. And so to have someone who has worked on questions of contract, questions of property, resources, and their place in modern international law was a chance that I could not pass up. And so thank you very much for coming and being with us, Richard. Mr. Davis has previously served as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Enforcement and Operations from 1977 to 1981. And prior to that was Assistant Watergate Special Prosecutor and Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. He was a partner at Weil, Gotshal, and Manges, LLP from 1981 to 2011. Among other activities while in private practice, he has served as chair of the Board of Citizens Union, chair emeritus of the board, and chair as well of the board of the Randall's Island Park Alliance, chair of the Mayor's Commission to Combat Police Corruption, a member of the Task Force on Police and Community Relations, an advisor to the Departments of Justice and Treasury on dealing with barricade and hostages and similar situations, and as a member of the board of the New York City Legal Aid Society, where he has also served as chair of the board from 2010 to 2021. On leaving Weil, he formed his own law firm, and since doing so, he has served as a mediator, an arbitrator, a counsel to various boards, trustees in bankruptcy, hedge funds, Fletcher International Limited, examiner in the Caesars Entertainment Operating Company bankruptcy case, and a special counsel in a variety of circumstances. Mr. Davis is a member of the Goucher College Board of Trustees, and a member of the New York City Campaign Finance Board from 2009 to date. He testified on behalf of President Clinton in House impeachment proceedings as an expert on prosecution. Why is he here? Because he is a 1966 graduate of the Department of History at the University of Rochester, and following that, a graduate of the Columbia University School of Law, the two great universities in New York. Welcome.
Very nice introduction. I mean, I'm glad you brought me this weather. It reminds me of my time in Rochester. I would have been disappointed to come if it was sunny and if there was no snow on the ground, because it wouldn't have been the Rochester that I remembered. So let me, I'm going to talk mostly about Iran and then link it to what's going on with the Ukraine to give you some of the comparisons in terms of some of the considerations that come into play. But let me just set the stage. In 1979, as you've heard, I was an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. I was 33 years old. I had a wide range of responsibilities, oversaw the Secret Service, Customs, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. In this really tiny little office, 14 people, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And what it did is administered sanctions programs. We now have many of them. Then we had relatively few. But on November 4th, 1979, my life changed. It changed dramatically because the embassy was seized, hostages were taken. And on November 4th, or 5th or 6th, no one conceived that it would go on for 14 months. We in the government didn't conceive it. And if there was a recent documentary about about the hostage crisis, which they interviewed some of the students, then students who led the takeover of the embassy. They didn't anticipate it. They thought they'd be there for a couple of days and it would be, a symbolic takeover, not that it was become what it became. But then the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the real power in Iran, decided, no, this was an opportunity. This was an opportunity to change the nature of the post-Shah government. Because the post-Shah government, right after the fall, was people from older generation who had been opponents of the Shah and plainly were progressives, anti-Shah, but were not really revolutionaries and certainly were not religious revolutionaries. And so what he saw and what developed, that this would become an opportunity to radicalize the government in the way that conformed to the vision that he had. So what was my life like over the next 14 months? Daily meetings at 8 a.m. with the Deputy Secretary, Treasury's intelligence liaison, General Counsel to go over what was going on. The Deputy Secretary would then go over to the White House every day to broader administration, what was going on, what we were doing, how could we coordinate. After 6, 7 months, it became 3 times a week. And then it was hundreds and many hundreds of meetings, interagency meetings, meetings with banks and oil companies who held, potential Iranian assets, meetings with people who had businesses and were harmed by what was happening in Iran. It was just endless. And as you'll hear, it ended with a last, at the end, 75 hours with a 1-hour cat nap leading to the ultimate release of the hostages in the accord that was negotiated through the good works of the Algerian government. One of the things that differentiated this sanction situation from any before, and virtually all with a footnote for Ukraine, was that 52 lives were at stake. 52 specific known individuals. And so that everything we did was a concern, how would it impact those 52 lives? And I say for the footnote for Ukraine, because in the modern world, well, it's not identify people in the same way. I think you see the immediate ongoing conflict in a very different way than, let's say, 60 years ago, when we froze, that is, said that nobody who held a Cuban asset, you had to hold it, you couldn't give it to anyway, you couldn't give it back to the Cubans, you just had to hold it. That was in retaliation for confiscating American businesses. Very different kind of situation. One of the first things I learned, and there's a lot of talk in recent times about the deep state. Well, to me, I learned the value of what I'll call the permanent government. Because a couple of days after the hostages were taken, a guy named Stanley Sommerfeld came to see me. And he had been the long-time head of this little office. For 30 years, and head of the office for maybe 20 or something like that. And he said, we ought to start preparing sanctions papers to freeze maybe, the Iranian assets, papers to, maybe put in an economic embargo, because he knew that their presidents, when they don't necessarily feel they want to or can use military force, they want it either for moral, political, financial reasons. They feel they must act. They must either show some effort, and economic sanctions is what presidents go. So he came and we had no guidance. Nobody had asked us. And we started working with no guidance. We just started drafting. I say we, he. And, maybe a few days later, we started broadening it out to the whole Treasury Department. And a few days later, broadening it out to the White House and the Justice Department to be ready. And then on the morning of November 14th at 7 a.m., I was home. I got a call, you got to get in the office immediately. The Iranians have announced that they were going to withdraw all their funds from American banks. And we knew that we didn't know how much, but we knew it was many billions of dollars. And we were going to lose leverage if that happened. So by 8:10, the president had signed an executive order. By 9 o'clock, implementing regulations had been issued, and the freeze was in place. That is, freeze that said, and I'll just go through one of the issues about when we say Iranian assets, what we mean. There were some policy issues in that if you held a bank account in Iran's name, and I'll tell what I mean by Iran in a few minutes, you just had to hold it. You couldn't let the Iranians have it. You couldn't transfer it to anybody else. You're an oil company who owed Iran royalties. You couldn't do that. You had goods that Iran was expecting to be shipped because they paid, you couldn't ship it. So everything was put in place as of that morning on November 14th. There was certainly a unique aspect to the sanctions. In Cuba, maybe it was $60–70 million. I know it was 1960, so maybe it wasn't, it's be a bigger number today. But even though the Ayatollah had taken power a year earlier, we were still a major financial and economic partner of Iran. There were many billions of dollars of assets that were held by U.S. institutions, and it turned out to be over 10 billion. And there were huge numbers of financial transactions and business that were ongoing that were being interrupted. And it was, you had to then address those. Now, I will tell you, I barely knew what a letter of credit was. I couldn't even probably remember to explain it to you. Now, I didn't understand. And so the blessing I had was that somebody from the New York Fed, a lawyer, came up to see what was going on. And he was planted in my office for 6–7 weeks to educate me as to the various issues that would come up. In implementing the sanctions, there were a couple of key principles. First, do nothing that would put the hostages in greater harm. Number one. Number two, keep putting pressure on Iran to try and promote some stimulation to getting the hostages released. Number three, protect the economic and financial interests of U.S. individuals and entities. But that was number three. And sometimes these interests clashed. And if they clashed, numbers one was first, numbers two was second, and three was last. Because again, some of you people may remember Ted Koppel. He had a show called, it wasn't then Nightline, it became Nightline. Every night after a few days, he would begin his show, day 20, day 21, until it became day, I think, 444 or whatever the number was. So what were some of the policy issues we had to address right away? And one is, what were we freezing? What were we going to freeze the assets of individuals, private corporations, or just government, the Iranian government and Iranian controlled entities? We ended up with door number three, Iranian government and Iranian controlled entities. Why? One, because that was really the way their economy was structured. Private corporations did not have the bulk of the assets. It was really government-owned entities, really, whether it's government-owned banks, the oil company, or the like. But we had, in Cuba, frozen the assets of Cuban individuals, and it became a nightmare. Why? Because there were so many Cuban refugees coming to the United States, just as there were so many Iranian refugees. How are you dealing with their assets? Also, we didn't want to start, the Iranians right away started talking about the Shah's assets we didn't want to make it seem like we could control the Shah's assets wherever they were. We didn't want to get involved. So that was one issue. Another issue was how do you, and this linked to how do you protect the hostages? Well, there were two issues that came up very early. One issue was obviously Iranian embassy and consulate bank accounts. We said, we'll give a license. Meaning we will undo the freeze as to those accounts because we want to show we're respecting diplomatic rights while the Iranians are not. Now, we did insist that they provide records as to what their transactions were because we wanted to make sure that they were truly diplomatic transactions. The second issue involved Iranian students in the United States. I don't remember the exact number. There's 20, 30, 40. It was a huge number of Iranian students. Well, how were they supported? They were supported by stipends, money coming from their families or from the government from Iran to an Iranian bank, and then they would get money to live on. Well, that money that they were getting was going to be frozen. Well, the one thing the US government, and we did not want, was a lot of television interviews of Iranian students saying they couldn't afford to eat, they were starving. We didn't want to do something that might stimulate attacks on, further attacks on the hostages. So once again, we said, we gave a permission, a license is called permission. We said, okay, you can bring in new money into this one Iranian bank, Bank Markazi, and they can distribute it to Iranian students. Once again, we required that records of all these disbursements by Markazi be given to us, which we gave to the Justice Department. I have no idea what they did with them, whether they put them in a file or they kept track. But that was another example of wanting to make sure that we didn't do anything to further the risk, further the danger that the hostages were already in. In Ukraine, obviously, a different decision was made on individuals. Why was that decision made? Because there's a totally different political, financial, economic situation and a different calculus. In Ukraine, one of the primary form of sanctions is to go after the oligarchs, is to actually go after these individuals, not to broadly sanction and freeze the assets, block the assets of every Russian, but to go off these targeted people. And as you've probably read and understand, the reason is obvious, because these are people who are perceived to be close to Putin, and you want to create some counter pressure that if they're suffering, maybe they can influence Putin. Not very likely, but that's the thinking. And you also want to show that there's a price. In all of these things, you want to demonstrate that if you do these things, there's a price to be paid. And you're not going to get away with taking these kind of actions. So the different policy, different fact pattern, different decision as to that. International unity was very important in the hostage crisis to maintain international unity in support of the United States. And we had it largely. We had a lot of good diplomatic support, but I will be honest, as I'll explain a little bit later, when it came to imposing their own sanctions, we did not get such great support. But we had a lot of diplomatic support, in terms of pressure, people trying to put pressure on the Iranians. And that was important to preserve. And again, this situation is different in Ukraine. In Ukraine, one of the great successes is that we've been able to internationalize to a large extent, not 100%, the sanctions, because sanctions, to the extent you want them to be really effective, the broader they are, the more effective they can be. They almost never produce immediate results. They always, almost always will take a long time to play out. But you want to have as broad a support as possible. Probably the best example of broad support producing a result was sanctions that were put upon the government of South Africa for its apartheid practices. That had nearly universal support. And I think that ultimately, again, it didn't happen overnight, but ultimately had a real impact. As I'll get to a little later, in Iran's situation, because we had such a high percentage of the Iranian assets compared to other countries, that the fact that they didn't take the same kind of actions we did had less of an impact. But it is important to try to protect international unity. So how did this play out in terms of decision-making? On day one, an issue was, well, we're freezing the assets. What about assets held by overseas branches or overseas subsidiaries of US companies? We had always taken the position we could do that. We could, apply our freeze. Other countries didn't always agree with that legal position. And we ended up splitting the baby, so to speak. We didn't apply it to overseas subsidiaries, but much to the British and the French dismay, the way the banks were structured, they were really branches in London and Paris. And we knew that there were billions of dollars of assets in those branches. So we said, as a saying, we sucked it up and said, we're just going to have to do it. We're just going to have to apply the freeze to all those branches and all those bank accounts. It was just it would let too much go back to Iran not to do it, even though it created a risk. Later on, when a formal export ban was put in place in April of 1980, we had to face the same issue again. At this point, some countries were putting on their own more limited export bans with a lot of loopholes, but they were doing it. And we decided we would not apply the export ban to the overseas subsidiaries. In other words, they technically, and you'll see why I say technically, could still export from the German or the British or the Dutch subsidiary of XYZ US company to Iran. But we really didn't want them to do it. So we put in the regulations that if your subsidiary was going to export, okay, you had to give, I forget now a number of days, let's say 20 days notice to the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And when we got those notices, I would convene a meeting. And I would tell them, well, legally, you're entitled to do this, but I want you to know that the position of the United States government is that this notice is subject to disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act. And therefore, and I don't know if you could appreciate the great emotion that existed in the United States at the time as a result of the hostage situation, enormous antagonism towards Iran. And therefore, if you want your US customers to know that you're allowing exports, so be it. But, it'll become public. Almost nobody allowed their exports from their overseas subsidiaries. There was a couple of theories we could have applied. There's actually a theory that OFAC had that I never fully understood. It said that if you were a German bank in Germany and had a US dollar account in Germany, that we could block that account because they backed it up with an account in the United States, and there was a theory. We said a step too far, because one of the things we were conscious of, is you don't want to undermine the US dollar. The US dollar is a very dominant currency. And if you go too far, you actually, you're already taking some risks, but that you had to take. But if you go too far, you could undermine both that, and that would have created a firestorm with our allies, an absolute firestorm. So, we said, all right, Stanley, as with Summerfield, said, all right, let's do that. Because, hey, that was it. I said, Stanley, sorry, no go. One thing we did do, we knew there was going to be litigation against the of the foreign assets. So we allowed the banks to use what we call an offset. That is, they could temporarily they could say if Iran owes, if Iran owes us money, we could offset it and say it's now our money, to give them some further legal arguments. We also work with the Iranian, I don't want to say that there was improper influence in the British and the French courts, but somehow those cases were never decided during the entire time of the hostage crisis. I will say no more. Another thing you want to do is maintain flexibility. And in this case, one of the key things, we didn't want the Iranians to know how much we blocked. I mean, we didn't know what their records were. And we ended up saying, I think in excess of 7 billion, but it was really 10, because if at a certain stage we were going to have a negotiation, the less they knew, the better. Also, in certain regulations where we allowed something, we made it clear it could be reversed. So we always want to maintain flexibility. People have said in Ukraine, well, you keep imposing new sanctions. Why didn't you do it all at the front end? Well, it's because governments often want to show the ability to escalate. They want to show if the situation is continuing, we'll do more and more. And, and that, is what happens, what's happening in Ukraine, and it happened in this situation as well. Well, as I said before, the freeze largely impacted exports. It wasn't until April of 1980 that we formally put in the export ban that I previously discussed. And we did other sanctions that sounded like they were sanctions, didn't have the same impact, but they as the original freeze, but show some degree of escalation. And finally, in April, we ended up expelling all the Iranian diplomats. And then I had to switch hats because the Secret Service Protective Division is responsible for protecting embassies and consulates in Washington, D.C. And I had to oversee to make sure that those diplomats could get out safely, because I'm telling you, the hostility was enormous. And it was, we had to make sure that it was, that they were not in danger. We tried to get other countries to impose sanctions. There was a UN resolution, which other countries said if it was passed by the Security Council, they would impose the sanctions under those sanctions. But something called the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December '79 took place. We put in sanctions against the Soviet Union, and so the Soviet Union vetoed those sanctions. And we ultimately got the other countries to do things, but I said there was a lot of loopholes. The British, for example, they gave us very strong diplomatic support, and they said, well, their export ban would only apply to contracts entered into after that date, and only if you were increasing the level of prior exports. So they could say they were putting in an export ban, but it wasn't very meaningful. So how did this all end? I'm not going to go into the failed military mission. It was a disaster. I remember I had no advanced knowledge. I wasn't senior enough to be in the inner circle. I was actually, one of my agencies was the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia. I was actually at a board meeting. And in the middle, I got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning to say there was an attempt to free the hostages and it failed. Not a very happy moment. So how did this ultimately come to an end? As I said before, by the fall of '79, everything we were hearing that it was that the Iranians were anxious for this to go away also. They had accomplished their goals. There was first, what I'll call the traditional secular post-Shah government. Then there was a more radical secular post-Shah government. And then there was the more religious, and radical government, backed by the Ayatollahs. So they had accomplished their political goals. In September, as I'll get to in a minute, there started to be some real rumblings. There had been previous attempts. And then the main event occurred. Iraq invaded Iran. Well, we had a lot of the money they needed. A lot of their military equipment required US spare parts. Their oil fields required US spare parts. And they weren't in a great position to go to the UN for support in reaction to the invasion by Iraq, given that they were holding the hostages. So that created an incentive. And then later on, there became another factor. It's called Inauguration Day. January 20th, 1981, incoming President Reagan was making all sorts of, aggressive sounds. We thought it was great, in the sense that it would provide an incentive to get it done by then. People thought it would be done by Election Day. Then, then all these deadlines disappeared. So we ended up, and my role in this was not to be the frontline negotiator, but my line was to figure out, it wasn't so easy to work with all the institutions around the country to figure out how many assets were really frozen, was to meet with banks, to meet interagency, to help develop the positions, and to do all sorts of things. But what was the core principle? The core principle is it could not be perceived that we paid ransom. That was we could do lots of things, and I'll give you an example. As you'll hear, the banks have, between their domestic deposits and foreign deposits, it turned out that they had about $8 billion of assets. And you could say, well, tell them to give them back. Well, that would be saying abandon rights that you might have. Well, if we did that, that would be like paying ransom. So we had to come up with some other structure, because you could, if you materially disadvantaged all these U.S. Entities, that would be construed as ransom. So that became a major issue. In September, the Ayatollah announced 4 principles. U.S. would pledge not to intervene in Iranian affairs, as some of you may know. That was not a frivolous demand. In the 1950s, we had, along with the British, had actively intervened to overthrow the democratically elected government to reinstate the Shah. So that was not the return of the frozen assets, cancellation of all claims, and return of the Shah's wealth. Well, other than one, we really couldn't do 2, 3, simply do 2 or 3 and 4. But in the world of diplomacy, every stage of the negotiation was saying, here's how we are satisfying this demand. And in the end, I'll tell you how we did. The other thing that was important during this whole period was the importance of back channels. It wasn't just that our representatives were the Swiss, but you needed back channels. Earlier in the crisis, the Panamanian government and some French lawyers, who worked for Iran, were a back channel. in the spring of 1980, which, turned into nothing. There was the banks developed a bank channel when they were approached by the German lawyers for Iran. Could we work something out? And the lead bank lawyer came to us and told us about it. And we said, fine, speak to them, but make it clear that nothing can happen until the hostages are released. And that became, as you'll hear, a critical and important back channel to help resolve some difficult issues later on. In September, through the German government, there was somebody who was an emissary, supposedly, of the Ayatollah. And, something we said, we being the royal we, said, how do we know this is legitimate? He said, I will tell you what the Ayatollah is going to say in a week or whenever as to the 4 demands. And that will demonstrate. And he was accurate. And so that became, and the Deputy Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, was put in charge. He and the Deputy Secretary of Treasury and some other people went over and met with him in September. And, we made some loose proposals, again, to satisfy these demands without satisfying them. And unfortunately, that channel evaporated with the Iraq War as soon as the Iraq invasion took place. The key development came shortly before the US elections when the parliament of the Majlis in Iran announced its interpretation of the 4 Ayatollah conditions. And the one key thing they said is they were proposed that the Algerian government be an intermediary in these negotiations. And the Algerian government had some very sophisticated diplomats and a very sophisticated head of the central bank, and we welcomed that. And they did become the critical way that these negotiations took place through official government channels and supplemented by the bank channel to try and resolve the bank issues. We were going along making proposals. And then right before Christmas, I was at a meeting at the State Department with Deputy Secretary of State, Warren Christopher, and others, Bob Carswell, the deputy, others talking about next steps when we get the word that the Iranians have just released the history of the secret negotiations through the Algerians and said they needed $24 billion. Well, we thought, okay, forget about the hostages being home by Christmas. This looks like it's going nowhere. And I think Warren Christopher, I said this in the documentary, was the hero. Because he saw that, okay, this is all crazy. They say they want, $14 billion or whatever it was, placed in an account to secure the return of the Shah's assets, or maybe it was 14 for the frozen assets and 10 billion, to secure the return of the other assets, of their own assets. And he said, look, but they've proposed an escrow arrangement. In other words, that monies will be put into escrow, held by somebody, not given to them, and they'll get it only when the hostages are released. And the second thing he saw was international arbitration. They included that claims could be adjusted by international arbitration. So despite the bombast in this document, he saw the pathway, and that's what ultimately led. He went to Algeria with a team on January 7th. He didn't return until after the hostages were released on the 20th. There was a lot of diplomacy. I was going to New York to meet with banks. We were telling the banks, we need you to be, we don't know what the deal will be. You need to have a decision maker. We had proposed a regulation that said the banks actually had to pay interest on the blocked funds, because interest in those days, you think it's high now. It was like 13, 14% then. And we felt, you couldn't, it was unfair to give the banks this huge, benefit. And you better figure out. And then Iranian lawyers came to meet with U.S. lawyers, and we monitored, to discuss interest. We monitored that. And then the big break came. First, they said 9.5, we need 9.5 billion. And then they said something, because the bank channel, through the bank channel, they've been negotiating what it would take for the banks voluntarily to release their deposits, given all the massive claims that the banks themselves had against Iran. And the last bank proposal was bring current, meaning because the Iranians had stopped paying to U.S. institutions, they've been paying other members, other banks, and give some form of security that you'll pay in the future. The Iranians rejected that, and we said, all right, what's going to happen? And then on January 15th, we get word through Christopher. The banks have said, the Iranians have said, they'll pay 3.5, I think, or whatever, billion of clean loans that they didn't have any issues about, but they didn't know there was another 1.4 that they didn't know they wanted not necessarily to pay and to put in escrow for future dispute. It just so happened that those numbers roughly matched 3.7, it turned out, of syndicated loans. That is loans which are not by one bank, but they're by a large number of banks. And there's an agent bank. And those had been so vetted. And the 1.4 roughly was banks, loans made by individual banks. And if you were worried that there were so-called suspect Shah loans, that's where they likely would be. And so we immediately convened a meeting for the next morning in the State Department. And we got representatives, and we had, like, if not the CEO, the number 2 people from Chase and JP Morgan, they were separate then, Manufacturers Hanover, Citibank, all the banks who had these accounts to come to that meeting. And we said, okay, we're not leaving here until we know exactly what money you can produce. We had been working with them all along on this, and how much in interest is globally going to be paid. And that worked out. They came to an agreement. The Iranians then reduced their number to 8.1 billion. We gathered around, and the most we could get right away, because remember, there was litigation in the U.S. And there had been so-called prejudgment attachments. That is, money, plaintiffs had gotten orders saying that the defendant couldn't move assets. So we couldn't just hand over the U.S.-based assets. And so we had assets that the Federal Reserve Bank of New York held. We had these overseas assets. And basically, it was structured that the money would go into an escrow account held by the Bank of England. I'm not going into all the details about those negotiations. So the Iranians could say they got it all back. I'm talking about the international, the Fed assets and the bank and the assets overseas. But then the hostages would be released as soon as 7.955 was there. But as soon as that happened, payment instruction had been pre-given to the bank, the escrow agent, that the money that 3.67 would go to the Fed to be distributed to the banks for the syndicated loans, not paying just U.S. banks, all members. 1.4 would go into an escrow for these consented. And then when we ultimately freed up the domestic assets, $1 billion would go into an escrow, and we negotiated an international arbitration for claims. So we could say that, well, we were, quote unquote, 1, we were pledging not to intervene. 2, we gave back their assets, but we gave it back in this way. 3, we canceled claims, but we created this arbitration tribunal to deal with those claims, which in reality actually probably put the claimants in better position than if they were litigating in U.S. courts because of prior technical issues. And as to the Shah's assets, we said, all right, if you sue somebody, Shah had died by then, and said, making a claim that these are Shah assets. Once you sue a particular defendant, we'll freeze any assets that defendant has, and we'll take the position there's no sovereign immunity. So we're addressing that. So then it's the night of January 19th. We all think we're done. And without going into detail, there was one technical document that the Iranians saw. It was not part of the main, it was one of the technical bank documents, which they exploded. Went nuts. And they said, we can't do this. And there was a panic. And the issue was whether this one document could be signed or you could find another way through a particular payment order. And the most tense moment I had in those negotiations, because remember, there was a bank channel and there was an official channel working on this very issue. And I was in the Deputy Treasury Secretary's office. The deputy had gone home for a shower. I was standing there pretty much alone. And there was a guy, former General Counsel Bob Mannheim, called from Algiers to say, here's my path to try and negotiate that document to see if I can get it signed. And I had heard like 15 minutes before the bank channel that they had a way, an agreement, they thought, to do it without that document. What do? I told Bob to stop negotiating. We'd go with the bank channel. And then I was really relieved when the deputy secretary walked in before I hung up to confirm that he agreed. I must say, during that night, we were getting calls. I got a call from some Harvard professor who's, claimed to be a well-known negotiating expert. And he said, I have my own channel, and I can get this done. I said, no, forget it. Because there's a certain point, you can't control too many channels. And at that point, forget it. And then there was another little wrinkle overnight, but I'll forget about that. That's enough to give a lot of people heartburn, where the Fed representative got nervous. Could he really sign the escrow agreement? And he was in Algiers without the document that we didn't have. He ultimately signed. We directed him as our agent to sign. And then we went to the deputy secretary's office. We've been up for, as I say, this turned out to be, before we went home on the 20th, 75 hours with a 1-hour cat nap. And we're waiting for everything's done. Payment instruction had come through, a little garbled, but we said to the banks, pay. We're waiting. And the Iranians, you may think, why would they want to reward Ronald Reagan? But they hated Carter for allowing the Shah to come into the United States for medical treatment. And it was at 12 minutes after the inauguration of Ronald Reagan when the hostages took off and the deal was done and completed. Now that created a little complication because we had all these regulations ready to go, but now we had a new president. And it took a month to get them to agree that we could issue the implementing regulations. But the key things already happened. The money had already moved, all of that had happened, but there was the regulations affected the assets in the United States. And then I'll just close with one image. At one end of this hallway, there was the incoming Treasury officials with champagne looking out over Pennsylvania Avenue and the parade, the inaugural parade. At the other end, there was all these haggard people. Barely can, then we had to go over to the State Department to give a briefing, but that was the real symbol. Anyway, questions? Yeah.
I have a microphone, let me bring it over.
Thank you. With regard to Ukraine, it's been suggested that perhaps Congress should consider passing legislation that whatever has been seized and held in the way of sanctions be made available to the Ukrainians to pursue their war.
Right.
What do you think of that?
Well, first I'll say we had that issue in Iran because at a certain point the president said he would propose legislation to vest, that is, permanently seize the frozen assets. We thought that was crazy. And the reason our concern was you sense this may not apply to Ukraine in the same way, but in Iran, with that emotion, you send that legislation up to the Congress, they're going to write in that legislation what any deal should be. They're going to put so many limitations on you that you may never get anything done. I don't think that necessarily would apply in the Ukrainian situation. It's just, it's a different situation, and now I do think it would produce, introducing the legislation. Again, sanctions take a long time. And, Putin is not the kind of, I think he'll let this country go to ruin before he'll be perceived as giving in. But, it does create more pressure if, the people whose assets have been seized have influence and they may lose them permanently. So, in this situation, I think it's different than Iran because Iran, we knew at that point there was going to have to be a negotiation. And it would just put you in a straitjacket if you sent something up and had Congress say, because they weren't going to just pass something, give you authority. They were going to put all sorts of, that's the nature of the political beast. But go ahead.
In this case, the sanctions are, as you said, against the oligarchs. And you're not actually seizing Russian assets. You're seizing individuals' assets.
That's correct.
And you're applying them to a specific purpose. And they're not going to be retrieved. After all, the country's been devastated and they were wrong. The Russians were wrong in going in to start with. So
I would feel that, look, first of all, again, I think it's not such a bad idea here. And I to say I have no sympathy for the oligarchs, because most of them got this because, as a result of corrupt deals going back to when Watson was president, after Brezhnev, Yeltsin, when Yeltsin was president, when they did the denationalization, that's where all this corruption took place, which led to a lot of these oligarchs. A lot of these oligarchs are really, part of the inner circle, powerful. So I don't feel any sympathy. And in my view, anything that creates pressure. And also, remember I said sanctions have a political, moral, and financial rationale. And this may be a moral rationale.
Another question right here.
Yeah, so thank you for your lecture, by the way. So in response to the gentleman's question earlier, and you mentioning how there needs to be some kind of pressure put on Russia. So my understanding of sanctions is that there are three things that need to kind of play in for sanctions to work. A sanction has to be put on a country for a specific objective. The country that is imposing the sanction on another country has close economic ties, and those sanctions are supposed to create some kind of hardships on their peoples. And a lot of academic scholars recently have been noticing that sanctions really only work on democracies. It's really hard for an authoritarian government to actually really feel pressure from a sanction. And I think that we've been seeing that a lot in the case of the Russia-Ukraine war right now. When you look at the specific objectives, a specific objective of putting a sanction on Russia would be regime change, which, as long as Putin alive or he's assassinated, I don't see that happening anytime soon. The second objective, Russia has a lot better ties with the East, who are quite reluctant in putting in a lot of these sanctions. For example, they're building their aviation sector still with China with the new C919 plane. They're doing a lot of space work with India now. And on top of that, a lot of the people in Russia aren't really feeling those sanctions because either, it is a more centralized government. And second of all, they still have a really fast growing economy right now, which is, partially in due to the fact that sanctions take a lot of time, but they still have been a growing economy. So I was just wondering more like how would the United States, or I guess the Western world and NATO alliance countries, be looking in the future to actually direct a sanction that would actually force any kind of pressure on Russia, or are we just looking in the completely wrong direction?
Well, look, I mean, I think, again, sanctions have a purpose. Sometimes it's a moral need to demonstrate that we just will not tolerate something. Two, I mean, obviously, I think the goal is not, I wouldn't articulate I don't think as regime change, I would articulate as withdrawal from Ukraine. That's the way I would articulate the goal. Even though I think in order to get the withdrawal, you may need regime change. Third, I think, you've identified the problem. I use the South African example because that was an example where the sanctions were almost universal. Russia has been saved by India and China. And that's a reality. Unless you can get not just the Western, but unless you can cut off these exits, in other words, these alternatives, it's going to be difficult. In terms of the impact on the economy, I think it does take a long time, and it doesn't have the immediate effect. And obviously, the effects have been lessened, but because they've had the ability to continue to sell oil. Now, if the price of oil drops significantly, that probably can be the best sanction that we could have. We can't control that because during part of this period, price of oil was very high. If the price of oil, and I'm not an oil expert, dropped, to levels that it was 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, then I think Russia would really be strapped. So anything we can do to drive down the price of oil is actually as effective as almost any sanction we can put in. Yeah. Oops, sorry, you were waiting.
So I was going to ask, how does asset differentiation work? Just because we've heard, especially in the beginning of the conflict, the seizure of Russian super yachts, things like that. So I know that you'd mentioned in the Iran conflict that a lot of this was happening within banks. How does that compare to the Russia-Ukraine conflict when you've got different types of assets and, super yachts and different ports?
Well, and you don't have just super yachts. In Iran, the assets identification was relatively straightforward. It was money in banks. It was money owed by the oil companies. That was probably 90% of it. It was, frankly, money held by the Defense Department, for weapons that had not been delivered. And then it was, maybe, just make it sound like it's nothing, maybe $1 billion of miscellaneous sort of spread around. But, and we did a census, we required people to report all assets and all claims. We did that in April and May of 1980. This is much more complex, not just because it's super yachts. It's because apartments that are owned through LLCs, through corporations. It's somebody who owns Corporation A through Corporation B through Corporation C. And what it requires is a combination of intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, and investigation. And it's much harder to identify. That's a reality. We've been at, some things you can identify. The super yachts are probably actually the easiest thing to identify. It's some of these other assets that are more difficult. I think I don't have the numbers, but I think we have identified a fair number. And then I think you just have to, if you find anybody in the U.S. facilitating a circumvention of the assets, you have to prosecute them. You have to go after them.
Hey, how's it going? I think when we talk about sanctions, I think there's a big problem in which, we talk about it just in the sense of like a diplomatic tool that countries use to get it to achieve a certain objective. But I think when we talk about it, there's a big lack of discourse on the actual effects of these sanctions and the people that they affect. So for me, in my opinion, they like, at least in terms of the discourse, we don't really talk about, you know, how people are affected and how people suffer from these sanctions, right? So when you were talking about like the three priorities that the US government had in achieving these objectives through these sanctions, it was the safety of the hostages, the pressure on Iran to win leverage in this hostage situation, and then protecting US financial interests. But there was I mean, at least I didn't hear, and I don't think it really was a US priority to think about the effect it had on Iranian people and the people who would suffer from these sanctions. And I don't know very much about the situation and how it affected the Iranian people, but I know how the most recent sanctions on Iran affected the Iranian people, affected the Iranian government, which affects their companies, which affects the people and their livelihoods, and they're able to survive and eat. And another example that we can look is Cuba, you know, which if you look at the decades-long embargo that we imposed on them, the effect that it actually had on people, you know, and I feel like we don't really talk about these things. So for me, I guess my question is, does the US government really think about these things when they impose sanctions? Because in my opinion, I don't think they do.
Well, I don't, I mean, think about it is one question. How does it factor into the decision is a second question. First of all, I should say, you know, sanctions, I was talking to Professor Flores at the beginning, you know, go back to ancient times. Think of a siege of a city. That's economic sanctions. And I think it is true. Now, I don't think necessarily the sanctions in 79, 80 had that material effect on the day-to-day Iranians, given the nature of what was being seized. But I think the reality is, you know, this is at least just my opinion, I'm not, that to some extent, the hope is, and I think this is true in the Russian sanctions, that the impact on the people will be sufficiently severe that it will create a dynamic which will undermine the government. I think that is a reality. I think that is for better or worse. I think that is part of the rationale of the Russian sanctions. Now, whether that's morally correct, that's a separate question, but it is, you know, it's very difficult, you know, obviously in a democratic country, but it's, you know, it's even more difficult. It is, as somebody said, in a totalitarian regime to get that kind of change. But, you know, what's interesting, somebody was asking me about before about the current demonstrations in Iran, which I think we've let fall into media silence because they are still going on in a way that's amazing. If you look at this recent documentary, nobody in 1978 would have thought that the Shah could ever be overthrown, ever. He had the Savak, a very powerful secret police. He had a strong army. This is maybe before your parents were born. It was, you know, that image of a cover of a New York magazine with the Shah with all his weapons. This is going to be the next superpower. And then you see this documentary and you see how that evaporated at a certain point. You know, so you don't know that it can't. So the answer to your question is, I think I haven't been in the US government for a long time. I think US policymakers inevitably have to understand and do know, in particular, not all sanctions programs, but in some of it's going to adversely affect everyday citizens of those countries. But the rationale is that's the only way to try and influence the government to change its policies. Better or worse, I think that's what it is.
So I have a quick question. You mentioned the documentary. Is that already out and where can we
Yes.
see it?
It's on HBO. It came out a few months ago, American Hostages in Iran. My part is meaningless. I mean, and seriously, what is fascinating is they interviewed students, they're not longer students, the then students who led the takeover. They also interview, although since he was interviewed, he passed away, Bani Sadr, who was very close to the Ayatollah, and then was, I think, the president of Iran at the time of the agreement, and then became a refugee in France. And it is fascinating to see how the revolution took place and how these student leaders, they really represented the secular revolutionaries. They saw the corruption in the Shah's regime. They saw the money to the military, the money to the elites, and they saw what wasn't benefiting the people. And that was their motivation. And many of them have now become dissidents. Not all of them, but many of them have become dissidents, and some of them not living in Iran anymore. It's a fact. It is. It's on HBO. I guess now you'd have to see it on HBO Max.
Hi. So many questions that one could ask. And I'm amazed of the story that you narrated with such detail, that you are 33 years old.
Yes.
And thrust into this consequential, kind of torrent of history there. I mean, a question I might ask would be, was there a kind of muddling through or a kind of a strategic vision and plan from the start? But really, more of a question that I would like to ask is, whatever it was, 2015, that the Obama administration's negotiation over the Iranian nuclear program. Part of the agreement was the release of funds that my understanding had been frozen since 1979. Were there the regime of frozen funds that you were involved in, were those funds remain frozen for those decades?
I think there was some, I don't remember the details. The overwhelming percentage of the assets got turned back. I think there was some funds that maybe the Defense Department held, and then there were some later sanctions, I think, that also picked up some funds. But, there was some pockets and there was some disagreements between the US and Iran over certain monies. And I'll be honest, I don't recall exactly the source of that, but, under the agreement, we agreed within 6 months to get returned the domestic bank assets and and I'll call the miscellaneous assets. That was done by executive order, and there was litigation, and it was upheld. And I don't recall. There was not a lot of money, if anything, left over from 1979, but there was some, I know, ongoing disputes as to what was owed, and I think that amount grew over time because of passage of time. And I think there was also some money picked up in some later disputes with later sanctions. Because remember, sanctions were imposed by Iran over time, not just because of the nuclear program, but there were sanctions put in during the 80s for various things. So I'm afraid I can't give as clear an answer as you'd like.
I have a quick online question from Erica F., who joined us virtually. She asked, how did you deal with the emotional and mental toil of living through this situation? And did this experience change you as a person?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm a crisis junkie. I had, already been in the Watergate office where I tried the first case at the age of just weekdays after I turned 28. So I was used to pressure. And then, it was I think it was very mission driven. There was, again, I said that a goal, was to protect the hostages. The fact that there were hostages out there created almost, there's an issue how long adrenaline can keep you going, but it is what kept you going. And there were ups and downs. The night I heard about the failure of the military mission was terrible. Every time we thought there'd be a deadline that something would happen, the Iranians will want to get it done before the 1980 election, and then it didn't happen. Or it'll be done before Christmas in '79, and it didn't happen. And then that $24 billion. But, there was the mission. I will tell you one story. About 2 weeks after the release, I went to the doctor. I told Jenna this before. And I said, I'm not feeling well. And he said, well, tell me what's going on. And I told him, well, for 3 weeks, I slept 4 hours a night, and then I went 75 hours with a 1 hour cat nap. He said, of course you're not feeling well. What, are you crazy? You think the body recovers from that? So at a certain point, the body does give out. But during this period, as I said, mission driven, you just keep going. There was too much at stake.
David Rockefeller facilitated protecting the Shah at the time of this overthrow, and I believe he was chair of Chase still at the time. And did he have any continuing role in this entire crisis?
Well, first of all, if you look at the documentary, really does document the role of Kissinger and Rockefeller in influencing the decision to allow the Shah to come into the country. Chase was an active bank. The lead bank in terms of through the bank channel was actually Citibank, and their lawyers. The lawyer from Chase, did play a significant role along with there was the 3 or 4 lawyers who played the critical role. So I'm sure that he was busy lobbying at some level, many levels above me, but I don't think anything he did had any influence at that stage. In the end of the day, it was what it was. And again, the bank channel was really controlled mostly through Citibank.
This will be our last question, and then you're welcome to ask Richard questions afterward.
Hi, yeah, I just had a brief question regarding the political and just general popular will of sanctioning in that era compared to now, because when I think of what happened at the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, there was a lot of attention paid to the extent to which we were willing to sanction Russia, but in the past year, that's more or less dissipated over time, whereas the way you portray it, there was a lot more vested American interest in punishing Iran for their actions. So how would you compare the extent to which American politicians and even just the people overall cared about punishing them, if you will?
Well, I have to say, you cannot underestimate the emotion created by 52 individuals, specifically named individuals being held hostage. It was enormous. And the media, never let up. As I say, Ted Koppel, every night, day 60. Day 61, every night he was on, and that's the start of what became Nightline later. The focus never really left. Carter made probably a mistake. At a certain point, he said, you remember this was an election year, he said, I'm not going to campaign until the hostages are released. It was not actually a smart thing to do. It gave power to the hostage takers, but that's what he said. And so the emotions were high. I think in terms of Ukraine, I think it's, for those first 2 or 3 months, it was so visible. I think, I think it's people still pay attention, but I think our collective focus just doesn't stay as long when it's not us. I think there's still broad support. And I think there's still a lot of positive political support for what's going on, although there's some people saying, why are we spending all this money? So I still think it's, more visibility than maybe other situations that you might have, but nothing to compare to 52 named individuals with mothers, fathers, children, husbands, wives, sitting in the United States, being available for interview.